Welcome to On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine. As you know, we're a show that reports, rebels, and we tell it just like it is. On our show, we examine the past as we think about the future, and that's exactly what we're bringing to you in this episode for Black History Month and the others that will follow. In this episode, we're wondering, why are people burning books? Why are books by some of our most prominent authors being banned? Why is it that the AP African American Studies courses received so much attention? Is that because there are authors that are now being blacklisted? Materials that children are being denied learning? And then what does this mean for our nation when we can no longer hold up a mirror to ourselves and, with some level of objectivity, examine the past? Colonialism, a past of Jim Crow, of American slavery, of women's suffrage, of indigenous people in the Trail of Tears. Why is it that in 2023 there is so much American fragility and censorship? And what does this mean about protecting important constitutional rights such as free speech and the First Amendment? How does that fit into matters of state-sponsored censorship of materials? Helping me to unpack these issues and so much more is someone who's been blacklisted himself, whose materials have been yanked from the African American AP Studies course, and that's Professor Roderick Ferguson. He's the William Robertson Co-Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Yale University, where he is also a professor of American Studies. I'm so pleased that he's actually able to join me right in this moment to talk about the urgency of our American history. Sit back and take a listen. It's such a pleasure and a real privilege to be with you, Rod. And first name basis, okay, because we go way back, right?
Exactly.
And, you know, when I saw your name on the list of professors whose works would be removed from the African American AP Studies course, I texted you. I was so surprised by that. So I wanted to talk with you about just what this represents in our country right now, not just your incredible, rigorous body of work being extracted and moved away from the AP American Studies just represents something broader in terms of the kind of censorship that is beginning to take place about matters that relate to Black Americans, Indigenous Americans. Everybody. Let's start with, were you surprised when your name appeared on the list?
Yeah, I was surprised. First of all, it's great to see you and great to be on the show. I was surprised because it was just unexpected. I mean, the College Board was not on my radar, I had received the emails requesting me to come and look at the College Board curricula. Emails of, we want your input. I had ignored all of them. They kept coming. And then one Saturday, I'm opening up my email and a reporter says, you have just been listed as one of the scholars who will be removed from the course. And, there's a tweet going out by the Florida Department of Education. So I was not surprised given the context, but I was surprised because it just, I was not close to it at all, right? I think what it represents, I talked a bit about this in the op-ed that I wrote, is that, it really represents a kind of crackdown on critical thinking, critical pedagogy, but also interdisciplinary work around the intersections of race, sexuality, gender, critiques of discrimination, critiques of labor exploitation. So even though it is targeted at African American studies, it pertains to all of us, like all the work that folks do within the humanities, the social sciences, law schools, environmental schools. All of us are vulnerable. All the work that we do is vulnerable because of attacks like this.
Mm-hmm. As if African American studies becomes a smokescreen
Yes.
for the removal of so much more.
Oh,
It
no.
seems somewhat nativist.
Oh, completely. I think it's nativist. It's an aggressive nationalism. It's everything. It's racism. It's misogyny. I mean, if you look at the original tweet from the Department of Education, you know, Angela Davis is ineligible because she's a Marxist. Bell Hooks is ineligible because she wrote, quote, many books on intersectionality. So I'm ineligible because of the work that I have done, in queer studies and the critiques that I have made of state violence and corporate violence, right? So it's all of that. It's the nativism, it's the misogynoir, it's, the homophobia, it's the transphobia, it's all of it.
Hmm. And I'm wondering what this ends up leading to because in 2023, we see this erasure taking place with materials that were in place 10, 15, years ago, at least in terms of what were in libraries at public schools. It doesn't mean that the students were necessarily picking the books up off the
Yeah, yeah,
shelves,
yeah.
but there were books that were there. And, recent attention can be on Florida and, AP African American Studies, but we know that for the last 2 years, there's been a movement afoot framed as let's remove critical race theory from schools, but really it's been a matter of an erasure of American history. And
Yeah,
the
American
thought,
history, American
yes.
literature.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most banned writers is actually Toni Morrison.
Which is stunning. She's won a Nobel Prize in
She
literature.
won a Nobel Prize, but she is, according to the American Library Association, two things. She is one of the most banned authors, and 2022 was a year of possibly the greatest bans on books, you know, in school systems, right? So even though they use the category critical race theory, they're not using it, in the way that we would, right? To sort of mean a particular formation coming out of law schools. It could be novels.
Well, right. Well, that's something that's actually surprising about all of this for a number of reasons, which is one, that critical race theory is a theory. It's a theory that may get taught every year at some law schools. It may be
Yeah,
that it's not even taught at law schools. It
yeah,
may be that the professor
yeah,
who teaches critical race theory usually has other classes to teach. And so maybe once every 2 or 3 years actually
yeah,
teaches it. It's something that not every student desires to take. And it's alongside law and economics as a
yeah,
theory of
exactly. And
how to
never
think
taught in
about
high
life.
school.
Right. Yeah, right. Like, I mean, there's so many theories, different approaches to thinking about the methods of law. Very recently, there's been a lot of talk about originalism, right?
Yeah,
But it
yeah.
is very interesting how it is this, which becomes basically the kind of scapegoat.
Oh, totally,
Um,
totally, totally, totally,
yeah.
totally.
And the
Well,
sort of
yeah,
proxy for
totally.
getting at sort of the denialism.
Absolutely. I mean, and to this point, that, when I looked at, there was what was it, Friday or Saturday? Uh the letter that the Department of Education in Florida sent to the College Board was released, right? And in the letter, they have 19 topics that had been expunged, right? And I looked at it and I was like, wait, queerness isn't even queer theory, queer studies, not even in this letter, right? So it means that those topics, those authors, like myself, work that I do, we were taken out way before, Okay. But we were resurrected. I was resurrected, just for the purposes of demonization and homophobic scare.
It reminds me in some ways just this kind of journeying about imagery and the stories that we tell in the United States, the stories that are prominent and the stories that get very little attention.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm reminded of thinking about the 1920s film Birth of a Nation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, because there are choices with the stories that we tell.
Yeah, totally.
There can be the choice of lifting up the book The Klansman, which becomes basically the
Totally.
film Birth of a Nation,
Totally
and
right.
something that's shown in the White House,
Mm-hmm.
the NAACP protests. In the wake of it, we see the rise of the Klan and the burning down of Black communities and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are the stories that don't get told, right? So the stories of abolition
Mm-hmm.
don't get told.
Mm-hmm.
Young people learn the stories of Confederates kind of rebranded
Mm-hmm.
as courageous people, as
Mm-hmm.
people who cared about home and country and just were
Mm-hmm.
simply on the other side of the line. But what's not
Mm-hmm.
included in that are the stories about what slavery really represented,
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
broad scale sexual
Mm-hmm.
assault and rape
Yeah.
of not just
Yeah.
Black women, Black girls.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
We don't hear about the
Yeah.
story of Sally Hemings, who
Yeah.
comes away from Paris with Thomas Jefferson pregnant
Yeah.
at the age
Yeah.
of 16 and goes there at
Yeah.
14.
Yeah.
Right. So the stories that are privileged and the stories that aren't.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. We don't hear, for instance, about Reconstruction, that even the many of the Southern historians and conservative historians at the time acknowledge that the schools, American schools, were at their best during the Reconstruction period because newly freed Black people who then became politicians insisted on public education.
Yes.
And so the
Even
anti
that, right? Like that's just a little point right there.
Yeah.
That newly freed
Yeah.
people who had been enslaved,
Yeah.
insisting on public education that
Even that.
everybody, yes, even that.
Even that. There's a fascinating chapter in Du Bois's Black Reconstruction on the public school system, where he says that white wealthy people, when thinking about the question of public education, dismissed it because they said, why do we need public education? We're wealthy, we have property, right? White working class people dismissed it because they said, why do we need public education? We just want property. It was actually the newly freed Black people who said, no, we actually need both.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're having a conversation that would be the kind of conversation possibly banned, right? Because we're talking about matters of history that are sought to be, expunged, as you say. But even when one thinks about the passion behind the desire for public education, this is coming from people who would otherwise be criminally and civilly punished if they dared learn how to read. Dared learn how to write, had to keep it secret when they did know how to read and write, or even the ability to be able to count. You had to be kind of deemed a carve out where it had to be justified that the people that you worked for were able to allow you to be able to count and use numbers because, all of this, embedded in law. So yes, these people would certainly see the value of education.
Well, it's interesting too, because related to this moment, one of the lines that I took out of the op-ed it was a line about racism being necessarily innumerate. It doesn't know how to count, right? Because all of this is over a population among the American professoriate that is made up of 6% of the faculty. Black people are only 6% of the faculty in the US.
How many of us have been the first ones in our department,
Exactly,
right? Like in these days and times, right? I was doing an event for the American Constitution Society aftermath of George Floyd's brutal murder. And it was a session about elevating Black lives. And the first session was with professors, and one of them was Patricia Williams, author of The Alchemy of Race and Rights. And she said something that I think just caused a bit of a pause and a chill. And we had hundreds of people who were watching this from all across the country. But she mentioned how at the time in which she began her law teaching career, there were 5 women of color in the United States who were law professors.
Yeah, I can believe it.
I mean, right. I mean, that is just really stunning. 5.
Yeah, well, this is the thing, right? It's sort of like, and then imagine that a national hysteria is organized around those 5 women.
Well, right. And fortunately, they mentored others and helped to bring other people in. But you are right, that foundation, right? I mean, it means that it is hard to find at American law schools, even in these times, what one could say would be a critical mass of people of color. Certainly not of Black people. And, the figure that you just shared, that 6%, if you are a person of color, a Black person, you very well know that 6%. And at your institution, I mean, it may percentage-wise be much lower.
It's a very, very small group, It's
a very small group that has tried to help provide an avenue for understanding what this history represents in our country. And it reminds me, Rod, that 25 years ago, actually, in the wake of Derek Bell, Richard Delgado, and others writing in that frame of critical race theory, the very public attacks, right? So it's interesting that within the context of the colleges and law schools, what's now pretty stable critical race theory, their courses being offered, though not everywhere and every year. But 25 years ago, when there were scholars that were looking to excavate American history and law and say, well, let's look at law from a different lens, the public attacks that were published in prominent news and magazines about how these scholars should be grateful that they had law teaching jobs. And that they were just whiners.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of the anti-intellectualism, systematic and organized, has always been interesting to me, right? Because I remember seeing Derek Bell give a public address, actually at Metropolitan Baptist Church in Washington, D.C., which was famous for also the Black intellectuals that came through and were invited to speak there. And I remember going one weekday evening, to hear him speak, right? Now, here's a figure who, in another context, another sort of racial identity, would be lauded for promoting an epistemic shift, in the field of law.
Okay, this is where we say break it down. Exactly, right? This sort of innovation. Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, but became vilified, for the work that he was doing. My first course here at Yale was a Black feminist theory course. And I, had imagined, okay, I'll just teach, 15 students at the most. It'll be an undergraduate seminar. And then 35 students showed up to a room that was only fit for 20, okay? Because that was the demand from the student body, for a course like that. One of the texts that I taught, the whole text, was actually The Alchemy of Race and Rights. That would not be a text that could be taught, if DeSantis and the right wing had their way. So all of the sort of intellectual production, the epistemic innovations that people have made for all of us, those things would not be on the syllabi anymore.
Well, what I have on my desk right now, because of a piece that I'm currently finishing for one of the Yale Law Journals, is a tribute of William Ellery Channing to the American abolitionists for their vindication of freedom of speech. So it's interesting about this particular speech that he wrote helps to illuminate much about the conversation we're having and the conversation that's going to be taking place across the country, because he is very sympathetic, as he expresses in this, their work to end slavery. But what he's stunned by is how, in the vilification of the abolitionist, there is the attack itself on the First Amendment. And he writes about that, and he talks about, he uses the word violence, and it was true, the violence that was inflicted on abolitionists. And he calls it deliberate, systematic efforts that have been made far and wide by those who are anti-abolitionist to basically undermine speech and the press, that which should, or one thinks, is protected by national and state governments. And I couldn't help but think, this is a speech that is written in 1861.
Yeah.
And here it is, and we are in 2023.
Yeah, it's an old playbook. It's an old playbook. And as I said to, someone recently, okay, when do you go after literature and speech via legal means? You go after literature and speech through the law when you realize that you have lost ideologically. When there have been advances that you can see, with respect to the Black Lives Matter movement, it was clear that many of those folks had been reading.
Reading makes a person dangerous.
It makes a person dangerous.
Right, because...
Exactly. Yeah. This was Frederick Douglass's point. It makes a person dangerous.
Well, because of course, when one reads, then one understands a certain kind of nuance. So in thinking about the conversation that we're having and thinking about where our Supreme Court is and what was probably the most shocking opinion that came out of the court last year for so many people who didn't see it coming, was the Dobbs decision, Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, which overturned Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey. There are some of us that had been ringing a bell for a while, dating back to the time when we were both at the University of Minnesota. I was writing about these kinds of things. But what's interesting here is that as the court talks about the importance of originalism, right? Let's think about what the ratifiers said, the people who wrote the Reconstruction Amendments. It seems to me that the court doesn't even engage with what the Reconstruction ratifiers actually thought about. These were abolitionists.
Yeah. I mean, this is the thing, right? That, this is the part of African-American intellectual history and Black studies that I find really, really inspiring. It was asking us to be better readers. Put simply, right? Like all that work that Toni Morrison did as an editor, where she's trying to build a Black reading audience around Black texts, right? All the research that she did to write books like Beloved, much of which comes from the books that she put together, especially the Black book, that scrapbook.
Powerful book.
Powerful. She drew on that work to write, and
she drew upon real life, right? Even thinking about Beloved, it's the story of Margaret Garner. Margaret Garner, who escapes from Kentucky, and with what can only be true grit and determination, decides she is going to walk across the Ohio River to get to freedom. Right. And she's going to do that with some kids in tow.
With some kids in tow.
With some kids in tow. She's going to walk. And it's think about it, right? Of course, she has no bus. There's no train. She is an enslaved woman who's about to become a fugitive slave, by the terminology of the time. Right. And with no Uggs, right?
No shoes.
That's right. Exactly. She is doing this, right? And what do we learn if we actually learn her story? What can we
Exactly.
learn about our history?
Exactly. I mean, and I remember reading Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, and there was a line that's stuck out to me. This is my junior year in college. And she says, before I was a writer, I was a reader. And also to your point, that reading, it promotes awareness. And if there's awareness, there might be accountability. And that's what I really think that these folks are after, the right wing. They
Yeah,
don't
it's
want,
yes.
accountable subjects to emerge.
Well, what's being articulated in the space of this is a kind of fear about children not being emotionally capable of digesting this history, which is, of course, a bit ironic considering what people leave their children to digest all the time, right? And this kind of
Video games,
right,
that.
exactly. But that they can't digest this. But, I think about, with these doors open, just what it is that we might learn from those archives. Recently I've been doing for recent years a really deep dive into the Reconstruction Archives,
Oh,
13th
nice,
Amendment, and
nice.
recently I've been looking at the advertisements from the 1700s, 1600s,
Oh, wow.
17, 1800s, sort of like mostly of advertising either the selling of enslaved Black women or advertising for the return of enslaved Black women. And here's one from 1793 that was published in the Virginia Chronicle. For sale or exchange, a young, healthy Negro wench and child. 'Tis not convenient to have a breeding wench in the family.
Hmm.
Now, isn't that interesting, right? To sort of pause on that. There's so
Hmm.
much. So she's young and she's healthy. How old was this child?
Hmm. Hmm.
Who has a child? And
Right.
then who's placing this ad saying, okay, it's been too long that she's in this house,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Like, what's the inconvenience?
Well, right. Well, I'm thinking that this might be placed by a woman of the house who
Yeah,
just,
yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah, 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 yeah.
And
Excellent.
just there's just so much power behind just looking into these archives to be able to understand the American story.
Well, you're touching on a point that is germane for the AP revision, because what they've said is that they want to just focus primarily on the primary materials without the secondary uh, resources, right? But at what point does it slip from primary to secondary, right? Because it's primary once you're talking about the ad, but the conversation that we're having draws on secondary literatures, like.
Oh, absolutely. And it would seem to me that of these primaries, right, because you can't leave them out in the abstract and they have so much weight. Here's just another one from 1799. And this one is about, it's captioned as ran away. And
Hmm.
the person who's placed this ad says a Negro wench named Margaret has a mulatta child
Hmm.
and is at this time pregnant. Then it describes where Margaret was last seen, but it has a closing note that says, if she returns of her own accord, she will be forgiven. And again, what's Margaret's story? So Margaret
Yeah,
is
yeah,
pregnant. Margaret
yeah,
already
yeah, yeah,
has a mulatto child.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
what
yeah,
is
yeah.
the texture of this and who placed this ad where this person wants Margaret to know all
Yeah,
will be forgiven if you come back
yeah,
to
yeah,
me?
yeah, 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 yeah. Exactly right. And which primary documents will they let, see the light of a classroom, right? Because there's one primary document. I have a book, since I'm from Georgia, I have a book of the sort of oral histories of formerly enslaved folks in Georgia, right? That the WPA put out. And there's a story that this former enslaved Black woman tells about her sister. and how her sister as a little girl was sold away to this man, and her job was to lie on the table as she was being raped, right? And then the sister died as a little girl, okay? And then I was talking to a friend of mine who is a slavery historian. She says, there aren't many stories like that because, uh, people just didn't want to disclose that kind of trauma, right? So that's a unique story in and of itself, but a unique story that is typical of what was going on, right? Would that kind of story make it into the classroom? Because, there's no way you can't then bring a critique of the slave system as a system of rampant sexual exploitation and violence into that, which is also what the DeSantis and ilk don't want you to talk about.
And yet it seems to be such an important aspect to really fully capture, if one wants to honestly capture
Yeah.
that history, because as you say, it was such a rampant aspect of it, such that the leading argument being made by the abolitionist, and this makes sense, the leading arguments that they were making, it was about those predations, about the
Right.
sexual assault and abuse of Black women and girls. That yes, picking cotton and being uncompensated for it and cutting the sugar cane was certainly coercive, corrosive, abusive, all of that. But the power behind the movement that they were leading was to be able to tell these kinds of stories. So, all right, a couple of other questions that I want to ask before I let you go. And it's been such a wonderful conversation. This has like gone by way too quickly. But the AP classes are basically, the idea behind them is that someone is prepared enough to be able to take a class that would be the equivalent of a college class. So I'm wondering how we understand that, because this isn't just high school, which, this is banning Toni Morrison from high school reading is itself such an incredible disservice. But when you think about AP African American Studies, the idea is that you are no longer within just the space of high school. This is elevated thinking. So how does one reconcile in that regard?
Well, I think what it is, it's a comment also on what we do in the university, right? And also maybe a signal that the university is also next, right? That because it's not just it's an AP course. It requires the approval of university faculty to say that it even meets, with the standards of university curricula, right? So they're not going after the sort of bread and, the everyday history course or English course. It is the AP course, the course that links the high school to the college, right? I think we would be fooling ourselves if we think that they are not going to follow that link, in their actions.
And it's what's also stunning about it, right? Because clearly, as we've talked about, this is has a certain kind of racial expedience. Because when I think about Tessa the Dubberfills, when I think about the work of the Brontes and whatnot, these are loaded with things. People being locked away in attics, rapes and sexual assaults, domestic violence, all of these kinds of things. And there shouldn't be talk of removing Thomas Hardy from, the school libraries, yanking the works of the Bronte sisters, from the libraries and whatnot.
Yeah.
So, Rod, what does this mean about American education? Ultimately, at the end of the day, when we see this kind of attack, one answer is that, yes, the universities watch out because, perhaps legislatures, governors are coming for you next. What else should we learn from this moment?
Well, I think that what you learn from this moment is that this is a very fragile enterprise, right? It's a very vulnerable enterprise. We can't take anything for granted. We cannot take reading for granted. We cannot take writing for granted. That those things have become part of a very dangerous political theater, right? The way I look at it is that, in a sense, it's also confirmation that we're also getting it right. Because again, you don't come after writers, teachers, texts, unless they're doing something in the world, right? And so for me, this is not a moment to retreat from the work. It is a moment to return, to the work with even more vigor, right? So, how do we use this to shore up American education? And also to make the case that, look, the work that we do, the work around race, the work around gender, around feminism, the work that is critical of like the big entities of the state and capitalism, the histories of slavery and empire. These things are part of the public good. They are part of the public good. So it can be a moment for us to revise our understanding of education as a public good. And that part I find, really necessary and inspiring.
It's been such a pleasure spending this time with you. At the end of all of our episodes, we ask about a silver lining. I wonder if there is even one to add to what you've said, because that reframing as a public good and as not being something that's just owned by select groups, right? Which is how I think that so much of history is understood. That's indigenous people and their history. That's Asian Americans. That's, African Americans, rather than this is part of us all.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That, these are honors shared among us. These are gifts shared among us, and we should protect the gifts. They have to be protected.
Well, it has been such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for joining us On the Issues. Professor Rod Ferguson, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Guests and listeners, that's it for today's episode of On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine. I want to thank each of you for tuning in for the full story and engaging with us. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode, where we'll be reporting, rebelling, and telling it just like it is. For more information about what we discussed today, head to MsMagazine.com and be sure to subscribe. And if you believe, as we do, that women's voices matter, that equality for all persons cannot be delayed, and that rebuilding America and being unbought and unbossed and reclaiming our time are important, then be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, wherever it is that you receive your podcast. We are ad-free and reader-supported. Help us reach new listeners by bringing this hard-hitting content in which you've come to expect and rely upon by subscribing. Let us know what you think about our show, and please support independent feminist media. Look for us at MsMagazine.com for new content and special episode updates. And if you want to reach us, please do so. Email us at ontheissues@MsMagazine.com. We do read our mail. This has been your host, Michelle Goodwin, reporting, rebelling, and telling it just like it is. On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin is a Ms. Magazine joint production. Michelle Goodwin and Kathy Spiller are our executive producers. Our producers for this episode are Roxy Zoll, Oliver Hogg, and also Allison Whelan. Our social media content producer is Sophia Panagrahi. The creative vision behind our work includes art and design by Brandy Phipps, editing by Will Alvarez and Natalie Holland, and music by Chris J. Lee.